Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the direct route to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, where we decompose the PMBOK guide for you into manageable study packages so that you can more easily prepare for the PMP exam. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. This lesson is all about the WBS, the work breakdown structure, and how we create it. Here you take your defined scope, you decompose it, and you create work packages that can later on be assigned to a team member. So subdividing your project deliverables into smaller, more manageable components is the major work performed in this process. We will cover the WBS work packages, the WBS dictionary, we look at the code of accounts, and of course we will discuss decomposition as well as how each of these come together to help create the work breakdown structure for your project. And then we will also take a look at our two outputs, which are the scope baseline and project document updates. We are in the knowledge area of project scope management, of which the PMBOK guide says that it includes the processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete the project successfully. And to lead us to success, we have 6 processes. First of all, we have plan scope management, the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. That is followed by collect requirements, the process of determining, documenting, and managing stakeholder needs and requirements to meet project objectives. Then we will define our scope. This is the process of developing a detailed description of the project and the product. Now we move on to the process that is the focus of this lesson. Create WBS. It's the process of subdividing the project deliverables, which we gathered in the previous process, and project work into smaller, more manageable components. Once we have that, we have to also validate our scope. And of course, somewhere in between those two processes, the scope is getting created as well. But that doesn't actually happen here in this process. Here we just create the WBS, we then hand it off to the executing processes where it gets created, and then at some point it comes back here to the validate scope process, the process of formalizing acceptance of the completed project deliverables. And our biggest problem on every single project is scope creep. So the process of control scope was inserted to help us deal with that. This is the process of monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing changes to the scope baseline. And if you followed along my description of these 6 processes, then you should already know what the missing box here on this slide is. Our table that tells us into which process groups our 6 processes fall, because I said that after we have created our WBS, we hand it over to the executing process groups. That means create WBS is also one of our planning processes. The main concept of this lesson is what you already heard in the opening sentences to this lesson. You simply take your defined scope, you decompose it, and you create work packages that can later on be assigned to your team members. And this subdividing of your project deliverables into smaller, more manageable components, that is the major work that we perform in this process. But just in case that you don't know, what is a work breakdown structure? Let's take a look at that. The work breakdown structure is defined as a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. So the definition begins with a hierarchical decomposition. This statement shows that the WBS is, well, hierarchical, with various levels and sub-levels, very similar to an organizational chart that you may have in your company and on your project, with the CEO or you at the top of your project and then the departments or team members below that. The work breakdown structure is a decomposition of the total scope of work. Another way to say this is that, well, if it isn't in the work breakdown structure, it will not get accomplished on the project. The total scope of work is in there, so include the entire scope of work when you are creating your WBS. Doing this will help you accomplish your project objectives since you are including everything in the WBS. And here's another important fact to remember. The definition clearly states that the components listed in the work breakdown structure are deliverables. They are not the scope, they are not the activities, they are not products, they are deliverables of our project. Two more facts to remember. First of all, the WBS contains 100% of your scope. This means that the WBS contains all our deliverables. If something is not in the WBS, then we will not create it. Conversely, this means that everything that is on the WBS must be a deliverable that our project produces. So if it is in the WBS, then we must create it. And second, the components at the lowest level of the WBS are called work packages. Work packages can be scheduled, the cost can be estimated, and they can be monitored and controlled. In other words, these work packages are deliverables that we can assign to a team member. So, as we have just learned, at the bottom of our WBS, we will find work packages, but even these work packages are then broken down even further. But this further breakdown does not happen here in the Create WBS process. We stop at the work packages. Instead, this breakdown happens in the processes of time management, to be precise, in the process of define activities. And there we decompose the work packages into schedule activities. So we later on take the work packages and decompose them into schedule activities for our schedule, so that people can work on these activities and so that we can create a schedule with this. But more about that in the appropriate process of define activities in the time management module. Now let's imagine that we have to give a status report on our deliverables. If you have a large project, you will also have a large WBS, and it will probably not make sense to give individual status on the thousands of work packages that you may have contained within the WBS. Instead, you will want to do this at some higher level, at some management control point within your WBS, and you will want to give an aggregate status report. For instance, if you have 10 types of training that your project has to deliver, then you want to possibly give status on all of them together, how the training as a whole is doing, not the individual work packages that focus on training A, training B, C, D, etc. That's why we have what is known as a control account in the WBS. This control account is a management control point in the WBS, and it is usually somewhere above the work packages. Where you place these control accounts is completely dependent on the project. Maybe your WBS lists 10 sub-projects, so a good location for the control account could be on the branch for each of those sub-projects, so that you can report on each of those separately. Quite often, the WBS is displayed graphically just like an organizational chart, but it doesn't have to be. It can just as well be in table format. Each line in the table would then represent one component of the work breakdown structure. And in order to make it easier to see at which level each component is, we use a numbering system. 0, for instance, would be at the top, 1 would be one level down, 1.1 would be the next level down, etc. This number, by the way, is called the code of accounts. So that means that each WBS component has a code of account as well as a title, just like we see it here. But what about the details? Where do we define who the responsible person is for delivering the training? And what exactly do we mean by carpet and seats? What type of carpet, red or blue? And by when do we have to deliver this? And if your company has stringent accounting practices, you probably also need to have a charge account where all the costs that accumulate for this particular work package can be charged to. So where is all that detail defined? This detail is in the WBS dictionary. And this WBS dictionary provides detailed deliverable activity and scheduling information about each component in the work breakdown structure. It contains responsibilities, milestones, a detailed description of the actual work that has to be performed. You'll find the appropriate charge account in here. You can also find technical information and really any kind of information that is needed for the assigned team member to complete this particular work package that you are now looking at is defined in the WBS dictionary. You will notice here on the ITTO overview that there are a lot more inputs for this process than there are tools and techniques or outputs. That is because this process takes a lot of what we already know, such as the scope management plan and the project scope statement, and uses two techniques, decomposition and expert judgment, to create our two outputs of the scope baseline and the project document updates. And by the way, did you notice that even though this process is called Create WBS, the WBS is not mentioned as an output? Why might that be? Well, I'll give you the rest of this lesson to think about why that might be, and we will talk about it once we get to the outputs. The 5 inputs that we have for this process are items that we have seen and talked about previously, so we're not going to review these in detail. In fact, this is the only slide we have about the inputs. What we want to do here is quickly discuss what they contain that will help us in creating our WBS. So the scope management plan is first. This is a component of the project or program management plan, and it describes how the scope will be defined, developed, monitored, controlled and verified. And obviously it will also discuss how we will create our WBS. The project scope statement, this is a description of our project scope, our major deliverables, assumptions and constraints. Remember, everything that's in the work breakdown structure follows the 100% rule. Therefore, the complete scope that we have in our scope statement must be converted into our WBS. That's why we have this. Next, we have the requirements documentation. This is the description of how individual requirements meet the business need for the project. This can be valuable input in regards also to the 100% rule. Maybe we find something in there that needs to be converted into a work package as well. Then we have enterprise environmental factors. They are an input because these are conditions that are not under the immediate control of the team that influence, constrain, or direct our program, project, or portfolio. For example, there may be governmental regulations that we need to follow that may not be part of the scope statement or the requirements documentation, but they still have to go into the WBS. Remember, the 100% rule. And lastly, we have the organizational process assets. Here, for instance, we're talking about WBS templates that your company uses. So if we already have a template for a WBS, why not use it? No need to reinvent the wheel. And that's it already for the review of our inputs, which means we are moving on to our tools and techniques, and we are going to spend a lot more time on the two techniques that we have here, decomposition and expert judgment, than we spent on our inputs, because you've seen the inputs before, you've heard about them, you've learned about them in other lessons. Decomposition and expert judgment, our tools and techniques, are important tools and techniques, both for you as a project manager and also on the PMP exam. So let's review those in detail. And to explain the tool and technique of decomposition, let me ask you this very strange question here. How do you eat an elephant? The answer is, of course, that you eat an elephant one bite at a time. You cannot do it in any other way. So then here's another question for you. How do you execute a very, very large project? Answer: you do that by executing one work package at a time. And how do you cut this very, very, very large project up into these work packages that you can execute? The answer is, of course, decomposition. Decomposition is a technique used for dividing and subdividing the project scope and project deliverables into smaller, more manageable parts. It means that we are subdividing the major project deliverables or subdeliverables into smaller, more manageable components until the deliverables are defined in sufficient detail to support development of project activities. This involves identifying major deliverables of the project, including all of our project management activities as well. The deliverables should be defined in terms of how the project will be organized. For instance, the first level of decomposition may be the phases of the project, followed by sub-projects on the second level, and then the largest project deliverables on the third level, etc. As you decompose your scope, there is usually one question that you have to ask yourself, and that is, when do I stop? The answer is you need to stop at that level where adequate cost and duration estimates can be developed for each deliverable, and also where you can consistently manage the work packages. But there is also the following general rule. No work package should, in the end, be less than 8 hours in duration or more than 80 hours in duration. So you are finished, as a general rule, with your decomposition when work packages are between 8 and 80 hours of effort. And if that still isn't good enough for you in regards to knowing when to stop, then ask yourself the following questions. If I decompose this particular package here another level, are the lower level components both necessary and are they sufficient? Ask yourself also, is each component at this level where I'm currently at clearly and completely defined? And can each component at the current level be appropriately scheduled, budgeted, assigned to one of our team members, and controlled? The answers to these questions will help you decide whether to stop right now or continue decomposing further down. In the end, each work package should contain a verifiable product, service, or result. Our second tool and technique is expert judgment, and here is how this will help you in decomposing the scope and creating your WBS. You can seek expert judgment from other project managers simply by taking a look at their work breakdown structures. Ask yourself, how did they do it? Look at the lessons learned and best practices in your organization to find out how we have done this before. See if it meets the needs of your project, and then you have a template which you can use and follow and show to other project managers, and they will talk to you, discuss this with you, and you can bring their expert judgment in. These lessons learned are very useful in these situations. And then, of course, there's also the question, how do I organize and decompose, and how do I do this correctly? Again, other people, other experts can help you in this. Well, there's really no right way of doing this. In the end, decomposition as well as the WBS really has to follow the needs of your project. But by going out, by finding other people who have done this before you, you can learn from them, you can bring in their expert judgment, and you can improve the way you create your WBS. And so we are moving on to our outputs. We have two, the scope baseline and updates to project documents. And yes, this is the moment when we answer the question, why is the WBS not listed as an output? And the answer is, the WBS is one of the three components of the scope baseline. Let's look at these three components. The first component is our approved scope statement. Remember the inputs that we have to this process? The scope statement was one of the inputs. So at the beginning of this process, the scope baseline only consisted of one of our three components, the approved scope statement. Then we ran through this process and we created component number 2. We created the work breakdown structure, the WBS, but we also created component number 3. We created the WBS dictionary. So in essence, the work breakdown structure, the WBS, and the WBS dictionary are created in this process as outputs, but since they are components of our scope baseline, the complete finished scope baseline is now our output. And then our second official output are updates to project documents. And you might now rightfully say, but wait a minute, project document updates? Why on earth project document updates? We haven't done anything. I mean, no project document updates were mentioned before this at all. We created the WBS, we break down the scope, we create the WBS dictionary. Why suddenly updates to project documents? Well, let's begin by taking another look at what happens during decomposition. During decomposition, we are taking a closer look at what it is going to take to deliver the scope. So what do you think is going to happen if you begin decomposing the requirements and scope in order to create your WBS and WBS dictionary? The answer is you are going to find new components, or you find that you can remove others where there may even never have been a requirement that came up. So that means you are going to have to update project documents. But before you can update the documents, we have to get approval because the requirements and scope have changed. So the logical next question is, how do we get approval to make this change? The answer again is we submit a change request to the integrated change control process where it gets approved. Once the changes have been approved, then we may update various project documents based on those changes made to the requirements and scope. And that is why project document updates are an output to this process. On a very high level, when it comes to questions that you have to expect about this process on sample exams, then there are two types of questions that you must be able to answer. They both focus on the WBS and how it is created. The first question, of course, is what is a WBS, and the second is how it is created. What is decomposition? You have to be able to explain this. So remember, a WBS is a hierarchical representation of the deliverables on our project, and decomposition is the process of breaking down the scope to get to manageable size deliverables called work packages. The WBS, however, also comes up again in sample questions as the wrong answer. Often you'll find questions like, what is a tool and technique in defined scope, where the WBS is listed as a possible tool and technique because we use it for scope management. But we have to know that this is wrong. First, the WBS is not a tool and technique. It is a document, so it can only be an input or an output to a process, never a tool and technique. Second, you have to know that we don't use the WBS in that particular process of defined scope. So make sure that you understand the concepts behind the WBS, what it is, why we use it, and when we use it. And here is a sample PMP exam question for you. Please identify the correct code of accounts for a WBS component on the third level. Is it A, 1.1? Is it B, 2.3.2? Is it C, 4.6.7.2? Or is it D, 3? Which one of these is a WBS component on the third level? And the correct answer is B, 2.3.2. The trick simply is that a code of account for a WBS component on the third level requires 3 numbers. But it doesn't have to be numbers, it could also be alphanumerical, so this could have been A3.2. That's also 3 numbers or letters that identify a code of accounts on the third level. Let's review. The work breakdown structure is a central document of the project planning effort. It is a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. The WBS organizes and defines the total scope of our project, which means if you cannot find it in your WBS, then it simply isn't part of your project. The WBS also subdivides the project into smaller, more manageable components, with each descending level of the WBS representing an increasingly detailed definition of the project work, ending up with the work packages at the lowest level. Without the WBS, it would be impossible to create a realistic project management plan. It also has to be detailed enough to provide meaningful identification of all project work packages that must be executed in order to accomplish the project's objectives. And the process of creating the WBS is very important because during the process of breaking down the project scope, the project manager, the staff, and everyone involved, for instance, functional managers, are forced to think through all aspects of the project scope. And this concludes our look at the Create WBS process. So it's time for Justine to say,
have a nice weekend.
And I say, until next time.